Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. Did you know this is episode number 30? Wow, I can't believe it. This has been such a great journey, and I'm having a fabulous time with all of you. Thank you so much for all of your support. Last week, I talked about all the scheming that went down to get the idea of tossing the Articles of Confederation into motion. This week, I'm going to talk about the convention itself and how and what were some of the major compromises that allowed the convention to proceed. How long did it take to craft the Constitution? How did they address slavery? And how in the heck did they get away with rebelling against their own government by drafting the document in the first place? Grab your coffee, peeps. Let's do this. Like I mentioned last week, a series of events and individuals happened to converge at the right place and time to enable the Constitutional Convention. This was thanks in part to a number of seemingly minor things: the Article's weakness, Madison's research project, Shays' rebellion, and George Washington's decision to attend the convention. Had any of those events not occurred, it is entirely possible we'd be living under a very different form of government. But alas, all the stars aligned, and the stage was set for men from across the country to converge in one place and debate what would become the United States Constitution. Philadelphia, May 14th, 1787. Touted as a meeting to edit and update the Articles of Confederation, delegates from 12 states made their way to the centrally located city to propose amendments and increase the strength of the Confederation Congress. But waiting for their arrival was a number of individuals who held a nationalist or federalist viewpoint and were waiting for their chance to advocate for a strong central government that completely replaced the Articles and altered the structure and power of the Congress. But they had to wait. While the convention was supposed to begin in the middle of May, it took until May 25th for the convention to have the required numbers to make up a quorum and begin their deliberations. The gentlemen who arrived to draft amendments to the Articles were not your average everyday citizens. Most were well educated, with many being trained lawyers. And of course, you had super nerd James Madison, who took the idea of a summer reading list to new heights with his research into the histories of every confederacy ever erected. I highlight this as a way of explaining how, in part, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were able to replace the Articles of Confederation with any semblance of central government. These were guys who, though flawed and imperfect, were probably the best suited for the task. Taking a closer look, Madison deserves a lot of credit for not only framing the conversation at the convention, but also for doing the research that led to the draft proposal that, for the most part, was accepted. I mentioned last week that Madison did a lot of research. He basically reviewed every confederacy ever built and outlined what was wrong with them and why they failed. It was this research, in part, that helped Madison craft his ideas for what the new government should look like. By exploring the history of confederacies, Madison was able to zero in on what worked and what did not. So when it came time to put his own thoughts on government to paper, he was able to draft a plan utilizing the best aspects of government history offered. Upon their arrival, the delegates agreed on two things. George Washington would be the president of the proceedings, and absolute secrecy would be required by all attendees. The hope was this guaranteed silence would enable all ideas and suggestions to be brought forth without worry over any blowback. This dedication to confidentiality explains why the windows were closed through the sweltering deliberations. They wanted no one outside of the delegates present to know what they were debating. Madison had his drafted version of a strong central federal government, known as the Virginia Plan, ready to go. Ever the shrewd political thinker, he knew his reputation as a nationalist was not a secret and suggested the plan be presented by his fellow delegate, Edmund Randolph. Randolph's leanings were far less known, and, in Madison's mind, his proposal would have the best shot at gaining traction and debate if proposed by someone seen by the attending body as middle of the road. Randolph agreed and began by first announcing his appreciation for the authors of the Articles of Confederation, thanking them for their work in keeping the Union together and sharing his appreciation for their efforts during the fight for independence. He then announced the Virginia Plan, a proposal that would, in essence, demolish the Articles and replace it with a very strong central government. Specifically, the Virginia Plan called for 3 branches of government: judicial, legislative, and executive. The legislative branch would contain 2 chambers, the House and the Senate, with each chamber's membership based on proportional representation, or by population. The plan also outlined how members would be chosen to serve. Individuals from the lower house would be elected in by votes by the people. For the upper house, state legislatures would nominate individuals who would then be elected by members of the House. Madison's proposal also outlined how states would be admitted into the Union and required individuals elected to seats of government to take an oath to support the Constitution. The Virginia Plan helped set the agenda for the convention by being the first to not only propose a massive change to the Articles, but also by demonstrating what could be put in as a replacement. But the plan did not have unanimous support. The small states balked at having a legislative branch of government built solely upon proportional representation. They wanted to ensure they had a voice, which is why they preferred the one state, one vote agreement found in the Articles. Just 2 weeks after Virginia's plan was introduced, William Paterson proposed the New Jersey Plan. Favored by smaller states, New Jersey's plan called for a framework very similar to the Articles. It would maintain 1 vote per state and a one-house legislature. The plan also called for a plural executive, with members selected by Congress and a judiciary selected by the executive. New Jersey's plan, while popular with the small states, was not welcomed by the delegates of larger states, who, justifiably, were concerned about minority rule. Before the New Jersey Plan could be brought up for a vote, Alexander Hamilton, a devout nationalist, made a speech outlining his ideal version of government. In Hamilton's universe, the chief executive and members of the Senate would serve for life, barring any bad behavior that would lead to their removal. The executive would have absolute veto power, and states would be basically subdivisions of the larger governmental structure. Throughout Hamilton's speech, he praised Great Britain and its government, making many believe he was secretly hoping to return to a monarchy. Bad play, bro. And so the convention was at an impasse. The big states wanted representation by population, and the little states wanted to make sure they held equal footing and power in any government plan. Here is where the art of compromise comes in. Roger Sherman authored the Connecticut, or the Great Compromise of 1787, which took a majority of the Virginia Plan and pieces of the New Jersey Plan to create the basic outline of the federal government as we know it today. The 3 branches would stay, as would the bicameral legislature. However, instead of 2 houses with membership dependent on population, one would be proportional, the lower house, and the other would have equal membership, the upper house, known as the Senate. Now that representation would be limited to 1 house, the next question was just how that representation was going to be tabulated. And the central question of exactly what to do with and how to count slaves began. The South wanted their slaves counted in overall population figures to ensure they were able to protect their property. South Carolina Representative Charles Pinckney is quoted as saying, "Property in slaves should not be exposed to danger under a government instituted for the protection of property." Ironically, though they wanted the slaves to count in population, the South definitely did not want slaves to count when it came time to pay taxes. The northern states argued if slaves were property, then they should be taxed. The southern delegates disagreed. The ultimate case of wanting your cake and eating it too. This deadlock led to one of the most cringe-worthy moments in our history, the 3/5 Compromise. Proposed by James Wilson of Pennsylvania and seconded by South Carolinian Charles Pinckney, the text of the compromise states, quote, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." End quote. Basically, all free people would count in full when determining representation, and 3 out of every 5 individuals held in bondage would be counted in representation and in tax liability. As odious as that statement is, it could have been worse. An earlier version of the proposed clause said 3/5 of all other blacks. As forward-thinking as these men were, they definitely had room to grow. As I mentioned in the episode on slavery in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution, there are records of a number of delegates raising their distaste about the institution of slavery. But, as fate would have it, the framers decided to address slavery by not really addressing slavery for 20 years. In Article 1, Section 9, the framers stated the laws around the importation of people shall remain the sole responsibility of the individual states, writing, quote, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the state now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, end quote. In other words, if the states allowed for the importation of slaves now, they were still allowed to do so, and Congress wouldn't look at any federal laws for 20 years. They did this for a number of reasons. First, they knew it was a potential deal breaker. The southern states who relied on the slave trade for their economy were going to fight hard to protect it. Second, they hoped that in 20 years the problem would be solved and the trade would naturally die out. Spoiler alert, this is not what happened. Oops. This union with the South was so tenuous that the framers even went so far as to include a fugitive slave clause. Found in Article 4 of the Constitution, it prohibited slaves from gaining their freedom by escaping to a free state. Quote, "No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." End quote. In other words, the southern states were given a guarantee that their northern counterparts would not aid in the hiding of slaves who managed to escape. The next critical issue for debate was the executive. Delegates were understandably very cautious about moving forward with vesting any one person with a lot of power. Concerned about becoming another monarchy, the framers spent a large portion of the convention arguing over just how much power the executive should have and what the role looked like. In the end, it was agreed the executive would be the head of the armed forces, have veto power, and suggest laws to Congress. But how would the president be elected? Here is where we get the beloved Electoral College. Insert sarcasm. Worrying about the delays in information during the time, the delegates were against an election by popular vote, fearing the voters would not have the full facts before casting their ballot. Or at least that's what they said. Instead, the president would be chosen by a series of electors decided on by the states and would serve a 4-year term. Who would serve as an elector was left up to the individual states to decide. However, the number of electors for each state would be the totality of their representation in Congress, and each elector would be given 2 votes. The one with the most votes became president, and the one with the second most would serve as vice president. Talk about awkward. Could you imagine if they tried this today? Whew. To counter the power held by the president, delegates provided impeachment power to the House and the ability to override the presidential veto with a 2/3 majority of Congress. Finally, on September 17th, 1787, after 115 days of deliberation, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention agreed to a new version of government. Comprising of 7 articles, the Constitution laid out just how the new representative government would function and what powers the various branches held. It still needed to be approved by the voters. Committed to making a government representative and supportive of the people, the draft would be routed to the Confederation Congress to send out to the states to ratify. Only when 9 states ratified would the Constitution become the supreme law of the land, and the Articles of Confederation would be no more. Ratification would take a lot of convincing and some politicking, including a series of essays written known as the Federalist Papers. But that's for another episode. Come back next week as I dive into the specifics of the Constitution itself. It's going to be a political scientist geek fest. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.